A gute Woche. Just to give a little background of before the Farbrengen started, today, before we start saying over from the Farbrengen, today is Chof Sivan. Chof Sivan is the day that the Rebbe soll gesund sein and the Rebbe Nishma Seiden came to America in Tov Shin Aleph in 1941 when they escaped Europe from the Nazis. And Chassidim in the last few years marked this day as a day of celebration, a day that the Rebbe was nigal, was redeemed from the hands of Goyim, and it's customary in the last few years for Chassidim to make big Farbrengen, and in 770 tonight, in fact, there will be a big Farbrengen, as well as many other parts of the world. On the walls of 770, there was a big sign mentioning that today is Chof Sivan, which is a special day, Yom HaBoyer, and the day that the Rebbe and the Rebbe Nishma Seiden were liberated from the hands of the Nazis. They came to the United States of America. The Rebbe started off the Farbrengen by saying, in the light, obviously, of Chof Sivan, that this is a Farbrengen that's taking place on Shabbos, but besides the fact that it's Shabbos, it's also a special day of the month, namely the day of Chof Sivan. And although to say a remez on a certain date, in other words, to take the letters of the date and to turn it into a certain remez, is something that needs a certain amount of authority. But on the other hand, there's a famous letter of the Rebbe Nishma Seiden that mentions about saying pshatim in Tanya, saying diyukim in Tanya. And he writes there that although to say different diyukim and to explain different pshatim that aren't mikubel from the Rabbeim is something which needs authority, not everyone is able, not everyone is in the position to be able to do it. Nevertheless, if it's something that could add to Yirah Shamayim, so it's something which is advisable, it's permissible, and it's even advisable. So in the same way, in the light of this letter of the Rebbe Nishma Seiden, the Rebbe mentioned that in the same way, that although to take a date and to mention a remez about this date is something, again, which needs authority, but on the other hand, since it's something that could add to Yirah Shamayim, so one may take the liberty to do so, and not only he may take it, but maybe it's even advisable to do so, because it will add to Yirah Shamayim. Especially when we're dealing with such a date as the date of Chof Ches, which, as we've seen in the years, in the past years, that people took this date and utilized it. They used this special day for a special hiserus as far as Yirah Shamayim, and there were good teitzois, a good outcome that came out of this hiserus. So certainly we could be certain that according to the klal mitzvah gereres mitzvah, that a mitzvah will bring another mitzvah, and the wording is mitzvah gereres mitzvah. The word gereres means actually it schleps. It brings with it another mitzvah. In other words, even if the person, for some reason or another, is in a position that he doesn't want to do the second mitzvah, but the original mitzvah that he did will force him, so to speak, to do another mitzvah. So we could be certain that Chof Sivan again, will, as in the past years, will be utilized for a day of hiserus in Yirah Shamayim, and therefore it's appropriate to mention a remez in connection with Chof Sivan, which the obvious remez with the word Chof Ches, with the numbers, with the date of Chof Ches, is the actual letters Chof and Ches, which mean keach, strength. Which the first thing it tells us is that any hiserus and any hachlota that we take as far as Torah and mitzvahs is concerned should be done with strength. And this is something which applies to every month, for every month has in it the date of Chof Ches to that month. Every month has either 29 or 30 days, but the 28th day, the day Chof Ches, is certainly there. So therefore, the day of Chof Ches is a time to take an extra strength, so to speak, that the hachlotus that one takes as far as Teira and Yiras Shamayim is concerned should be done with an extra strength. Then the Rebbe started connecting this idea also with the Rambam that we're learning these days. The Rebbe mentioned that we find a difference between the Rambam at the end of Hilchas Korbanos as opposed to the Rambam in the end of Hilchas Aveda. Normally, as we know that at the end of every Sefer of Rambam, the Rambam mentions a few words connected, not actually halachis, but rather something which is his eirus in Yiras Shamayim. There are a number. Shamayim. There are a few halachas where the Rambam doesn't mention it, and that's something which needs a hasbara, something which has to be explained why in those particular svarim the Rambam doesn't mention. But on a general rule, and at the end of every sefer, the Rambam mentions a few words, which is a his eirus in Yiras Shamayim. So at the end of Hilchas of Aveda, of Sefer Aveda, which is Hilchas Me'ilah, the Rambam mentions that all mitzvahs are gzeiros and chukim. It's something which is actually a decree of the Eibishter, and something which a person's supposed to obey, not because he understands it, because he understands the reason for it, but rather is because the Eibishter said so, which would go into the category of chukim, a chukah, which is a mitzvah that has no explanation, but it's rather just something that the Eibishter told us to do, and therefore we obey. At the end of Hilchas Tmura, which is the end of the next Sefer, Sefer HaKorbanos, which is a Sefer which we finished, by the way, yesterday, according to the shir of learning 3 prakim a day, the Rambam mentioned that although he already mentioned in Hilchas Me'ilah that mitzvahs, most mitzvahs go under the category of chukim, but nevertheless, a person is supposed to find a certain reason for a mitzvah. A person is supposed to be mizbeinen, think into it, the mitzvahs. And if a person could find a reason for a mitzvah, that would be, it's appropriate to try to find a reason for a mitzvah. And through finding the reasons for the mitzvahs, a person will learn how to conduct himself in his day-to-day life. And the Rambam explains over here a reason for the mitzvah of Tumura, which is to prevent a person's Yetzer Hara from being able to take a hold of him. In other words, if a person is going to exchange one carbon for another carbon, eventually he will exchange a good behemoth for a bad behemoth, and therefore trying to minimize in his expense in being makriv karbanos. So the Rebbe explained that in reality these are 2 ways of looking at Avedas Hashem, in a person's outlook on Avedas Hashem. There's one way that a person obeys what the Eibishter told him to do. In other words, there is an Odin and an Eved, a master and a servant, and the person, so to speak, does what he is told to do. That is one way of looking at his relationship with the Eibishter. But on the other hand, there is another way that a person actually does something with his own initiative, and not only he obeys what the Eibishter tells him to do, but rather he utilizes his own seichel and his own midas, and he utilizes it in the service of Hashem, which is obviously a higher level in Aveda as opposed to the first way of Aveda. The first way of Aveda is that a person just obeys. A person, so to speak, negates his interests, his own things, and rather listens to what the Eibishter says. But the second Eifan Aveda, the Aveda of Hilchas Tmura, is where a person is, so to speak, looking for a reason for what the Eibishter told him to do, and thereby being able to utilize this reason in further serving Hashem. And the Rebbe connected it with the Parshas HaShavua, the Parsha Shlach Lecha Anoshim, which is dealing with the Parsha of Meraglim. We find that the first pasuk, the second pasuk of the Parsha, it mentions Shlach Lecha Anoshim. So Rashi explains what does the word Lecha mean? That the Eibishter told Moshe L'daitcha. In other words, the sending of the Meraglim, the sending of the spies, is something which depends on your das, on your seichel. Ani eini mitzav lecha. I am not telling you, there's no commandment for you to send the Meraglim. If you want to do it, then you can do it. Which seemingly would seem to say that the Eibishter was already hinting to Moshe that it's not advisable to send the Meraglim. And that's why the Eibishter obviously is not telling him to send the Meraglim. He's just saying that if you want to send the Meraglim, you have that choice. So the question is, Moshe Rabbeinu, which is the one that received Teira Misinai, he is the one that should have understood this is this hint, that it's not advisable to send the Meraglim, so why did he send the Meraglim? And at the end we see that through the sending of the Meraglim, it caused that the Jews should remain in the Midbar for another 40 years and postpone their entering of Eretz Yisrael for 40 years. And the Rebbe mentioned at that point in time that this year again is the 40th year from the Histalkus of the Frierdiker Rebbe, which is the time as at the end of the 40 years by Moshe Rabbeinu, where Moshe Rabbeinu told Eden that now is the time that they have a leiv ladas, a heart to understand, ve'inayim lireis, and eyes to be able to see, v'aznayim lishmeya, and ears that are able to hear. But in any case, they postponed their entering Eretz Yisrael for 40 years. And this was all because of the Meraglim. And the Eibishter, so to speak, hinted to Moshe that it's not advisable to send the Meraglim. And therefore, I am not telling you to send the Meraglim. And so why did Moshe get this hint? So the Rebbe explains that in the service of Hashem there are two types of service, as we mentioned before. There's the service of Hashem where a person obeys what he is commanded to do. Which means the Eibishter tells you to do it, you do it. That's one way of serving Hashem. There's another way of serving Hashem, which is l'daitcha. L'daitcha means that the Eibishter is telling you, you utilize what you have. I gave you seichel, the Eibishter said, I gave you seichel and I gave you everything else. And you are to utilize what you have in the service of Hashem, which is a much higher level of service of Hashem as opposed to the first way. The first way, a person is merely, so to speak, forgetting about himself and listening to the Eibishter. The second way, a person is taking his own self and utilizing his own self in the service of Hashem. And that was the idea of Shlach Lecha Anoshim, Moshe Rabbeinu. When Moshe Rabbeinu heard from the Eibishter, Ani eini mitzav lecha, I am not telling you. So it's not, doesn't mean that Moshe Rabbeinu shouldn't do it. Moshe Rabbeinu understood that we're dealing here with a higher type of service of Hashem. There was the service of Hashem until the situation of the Meraglim, and there was the service of Hashem that the Eibishter is giving him the opportunity now. And this opportunity is that the Eibishter is telling a Yid, and firstly Moshe Rabbeinu, that you are able to do the service of Hashem l'daitcha, with your own seichel. And ani eini mitzav lecha, I am not telling you. The question is, the Rebbe asked, why does it say ani eini mitzav lecha? In other words, as soon as it says l'daitcha, we understand ani eini mitzav lecha. So the Rebbe mentioned again what he mentioned last week, that when Rashi says, normally Rashi says what the right pshat is. Rashi doesn't say what the wrong pshat is. He doesn't say that this is wrong and this is right. He normally only says what is right. Originally he says the right pshat. When Rashi mentions a pshat and he says that the pshat is not right, it obviously means that it's not completely not right. Because if it would be completely not right, there would be no point in mentioning it. So it may not be completely right. But on the other hand, it's certainly not completely not right. So when Rashi says, like the Rebbe mentioned last week, Yochel, we could think that this is the pshat, it means because there is a place to say that that's pshat. Even at the end of Rashi, when Rashi says it's not the pshat, it means it's not the real pshat, but not that it's completely wrong. In the same way the Rebbe said, when Rashi says, Ani eini metzav lecha, which means he's saying that that is not the pshat, I am not telling you. It means that the idea of telling you is appropriate. There is a place for the Eibishter to tell Moshe to send the meraglim. However, over here, he's not telling you. Why isn't he telling you? Not because there would be no point in telling. There would be a point in telling, because sending meraglim was something that's good. But the reason why the Eibishter didn't tell Moshe to send the meraglim is because he wanted Moshe Rabbeinu and the Yidden to come to a level which is higher than the Eibishter telling him. He should come to that new level of Avedas Hashem, the level of Avedas Hashem which is connected with L'daitcha, with your own das, that you should do it on your own. What's the point of sending the meraglim? The point of sending meraglim is very simple. That when the Yidden had to go into Eretz Yisrael, so of course they could have gone to Eretz Yisrael in a way of nest that the Eibishter would have fought for them and everything would have been fine. But on the other hand, since everything has to be melubish, enclosed in Darkei HaTeva, the laws of nature, so the laws of nature, the normal procedure, when a country is going, when a people are going to conquer a country, is that they send spies to find out what the country looks like, and what's the best way of entering the country, etc., etc. So the idea of sending meraglim is something which makes sense. It's not something which doesn't make sense. And it would even make sense for the Eibishter to tell the Yidden to send the meraglim. Why didn't the Eibishter tell the Yidden to send the meraglim? The reason for it was not because the Eibishter didn't want them to go, but rather because the Eibishter wanted them to come to a higher Aveda. And the Aveda of L'daitcha, which Ani eini metzav lecha. And the Rebbe also connected it with what he spoke last week, that the Pasuk says, Mehavaya, mitzadi gever keinonu, v'darkei yechpotz, which means that from the Eibishter are the steps of a person, the place where a person goes. It is decided by the Eibishter, v'darkei, and his ways, yechpotz, he will want. Now the question is, what is v'darkei, and his ways, who is it referring to? So the Rebbe mentioned in the name of the Frierdiker Rebbe that there are two pirushim. One pirush is v'darkei is going on the person, and the other pirush is that v'darkei is referring to the derech of the Eibishter. So the Rebbe explained that these are the two ways of the service of Hashem. There's the way of the service of Hashem, which is connected to the derech of the Eibishter. In other words, a person goes on the way that the Eibishter, the path that the Eibishter prepares for him. So what is his Aveda? What does his service entail? Merely forgetting about his own interests, not doing what he wants to do, but rather doing what the Eibishter wants him to do. That's v'darkei, the derech of the Eibishter, that's what he goes. Then there's another way of the service of the Eibishter, and it's a higher level. The higher level of the service of Hashem is that there is a derech, his own derech. There's the derech of the person, and the person sees to it that his derech should be the derech of the Eibishter. In other words, not he, so to speak, forgetting about his own derech, but rather he's making that his derech, he causes that his derech should coincide, and more than coincide, become one thing with the derech of the Eibishter. And the Rebbe explained that this also explains why we find later on that Yehoshua in the Haftarah of Shlach, it mentions that Yeshua also sent Meraglim. The question is, if Meraglim is something that isn't good, it's not good to send. And we see that through the sending of Meraglim, the Jews postponed their entering in Eretz Yisrael for 40 years. So why is it that Yeshua again sent Meraglim? And we don't find that the Eibishter told Yeshua to send Meraglim. We don't even find that Yeshua asked anybody for advice whether or not to send Meraglim. It just says that Yeshua sent Meraglim. So the answer is because the sending of Meraglim is something which is appropriate. It's something which makes a lot of sense. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu also sent Meraglim. The only thing is that when Moshe Rabbeinu sent Meraglim, it didn't work out the way it was supposed to work out. But at that point in time, they were trying to come to a higher level than they would have come if the Eibishter would have told them to send the Meraglim. And that's why we also find that Moshe Rabbeinu, it says that by the Meraglim, Moshe Rabbeinu added a letter to Yehoshua's name. Originally, Yeshua's name was Hisheya bin Nun. And then his name became Yehoshua. So Rashi explains that Moshe Rabbeinu added the Yud to Yeshua's name, which signifies that Ko Yeshiyacha me'atzas Meraglim. The Eibishter should help you from the eights of the Meraglim. So the Rebbe asked if Moshe Rabbeinu already knew that there was atzas Meraglim and Yeshua needs a bracha. So how did Moshe Rabbeinu send the Meraglim in the first place? Secondly, if Yeshua needed a bracha, why didn't he give a bracha to everyone? So the explanation is that when Moshe Rabbeinu sent the Meraglim, from Moshe Rabbeinu's perspective, there was no problem. The Meraglim were shluchim of Moshe Rabbeinu, and shluchei shel adam k'meisei. So certainly nothing could, if they would have remained shluchim of Moshe Rabbeinu, no bad would have come out of it. What happened was that the Meraglim didn't do what they were told to do. They were sent to find out about the land, to find out whether it's open cities or closed cities, different things about the land. But they weren't asked to come back and tell the Yidden whether or not it pays to go to Eretz Yisrael. They were only supposed to tell the Yidden what the land looks like. When they came back and they started saying what it looks like, and at the end they finished off by saying that we cannot enter Eretz Yisrael. When they started saying those words, at that point in time, they were no longer shluchim of Moshe Rabbeinu. Because we have a klal that a shliach is only a shliach when he does what he was told to do by the Mishalech, by the one that sent him. As soon as he starts, a shliach, sheshina midas ha-mishalech, as soon as a shliach changes and doesn't do what the Mishalech told him to do, he's no longer a shliach. If he's no longer a shliach, that's when the problem started. Yeshua, on the other hand, Moshe Rabbeinu, because of the fact that Yeshua was a special Talmud by Moshe Rabbeinu, and he was a Talmud that always remained with Moshe Rabbeinu. So Moshe Rabbeinu knew that going there was somewhat of a sakana, not a sakana which was impossible to overcome, but there was a sakana, so therefore there was an extra bracha that was given to Yeshua, that Ko Yeshiyacha me'atzas Meraglim. And as the Rabbi even concluded later on, that it was niba v'liyodem niba. It's not something that Moshe Rabbeinu actually knew that there would be a problem with the Meraglim. Moshe Rabbeinu added a name to Yeshua that there should be a special bracha to him. And this letter, the Yud, was in a way of a niba v'liyodem niba, that Ko Yeshiyacha me'atzas Meraglim. The Rebbe also connected this idea We find the pasuk says, "Va'ata yigdal no keach adni." That Moshe Rabbeinu said that the keach of the Eibishter should become greater. So the Gemara says that what happened was that the Eibishter told Moshe Rabbeinu, "Hoye lecho liyezreini," that you should have helped me. And that's when Moshe Rabbeinu said, "Va'ata yigdal no keach adni." So kaviyachol, it seems like Moshe Rabbeinu is, so to speak, helping out the Eibishter. And the Eibishter is asking for help. And Moshe Rabbeinu, by saying Yigdal no keach adni, is, so to speak, adding to the strength of the Eibishter. So what does it mean? So again, it coincides with the idea, with the trend that the Rebbe was speaking until this point in the Sicha, that there's two types of Avedas. There is Aveda where a person merely listens. He obeys, he's obedient. Then there is a Aveda where a person actually adds strength. Kaviyachol l'mayla. That's the Yigdal no keach adni. And that is also the Aveda of L'daitcha. The Aveda where a person uses his own initiative. And he uses, and he utilizes his own individualism, his own, everything about him in the service of Hashem, as opposed to merely obeying the Eibishter. The Rabbi explained that that's also what it's meant in the two Ma'amari Chazal. One Ma'amar Chazal says, "Batel ritzeincha mipnei ritzeini," that you should negate your ratzon for the Eibishter's ratzon. That if the Eibishter wants something, and you want something, you should be mevatel your ratzon for the Eibishter's ratzon. Then there's another Ma'amar Chazal that says, that you should see to it that the Eibishter's ratzon should be like your ratzon. Which means, what's the difference between these two Ma'amari Chazal? In the first Ma'amar Chazal, we're dealing with Hascholas Aveda, where a Jew begins his Aveda and he's merely obeying the Eibishter. That's Batel Ritzeincha Mipnei Ritzeini. The second level of Aveda is that we're dealing with a person that has a ratzon. He's not putting his ratzon on the side. He's remaining with a ratzon. But he's accomplishing that his ratzon should coincide and become one thing with the Eibishter. Asay ritzeinei ki ritzeincha. This Aveda, that a person should see to it that his ratzon should become one thing with the ratzon of the Eibishter, and the idea of Shlach lecho l'daitcha is not something which a person has b'keach atzmi. A person's own strength, he can't have such a keach. That only comes through the keach that the Eibishter gives him milmayla. Because if everything that a person has, he needs keach milmayla for it, to do any type of Aveda, there always has to be a Sarusa Delayla. Certainly, when we're dealing with such a type of an Aveda which is higher than a normal type of Aveda, the Aveda of L'daitcha, the Aveda of Asei Ritzeinei ki ritzeincha, the Aveda of B'dar Kei Yechpot. In other words, that a person has his own derech, and that derech becomes one thing with the derech of the Eibishter. He's utilizing his own keiches, the keiches that the Eibishter gave him, and he's utilizing them that they should become one thing with the Eibishter, with the way the Eibishter wants. So certainly that comes with a keach milmayla, and even more than a normal Aveda has to come with keach milmayla. And what kind of keach milmayla? The keach of the Eibishter himself, because as it's brought down that the idea of bchira, the idea of free choice, the true concept of free choice is something which a person is able to choose something regardless of anything else. In other words, normally when a person chooses something, obviously it depends on his surroundings, on his upbringing. There's a lot of things that will have an effect on what this person will eventually choose. The concept of bchira chofshis, what does it mean, true free choice, is that a person is free to choose something regardless of his past, regardless of his environment, regardless of his upbringing. A person is able to choose freely. Now, how is a person able to choose freely? It's only because of this chelik elikami mal mamish. Because a person is one thing, a Jew is one thing with the Eibishter. So the Eibishter gives him this keach of bchira chofshis, which is one thing with the Eibishter, which in reality a goy lahavdil doesn't have it. Only a yid, because he's a chel, one thing with the Eibishter, he's a chelik elikami mal mamish. He has the true concept of free choice. And this idea of free choice, which a person is, so to speak, utilizing his very essence, which is connected to the very essence of the Eibishter, and choosing the Eibishter, that is the same idea as l'daitcha, which means he's utilizing his own self for the Eibishter. In the beginning, the Rebbe will mention, when the Rebbe started speaking about the idea of keach, that Chof ches is the letters of the word keach. So the Rebbe right away connected it, that it says, there's a Maimer Chazal that says, the Gemara says, that kol ha'emer amin yehish meirabe b'chol keichei is ma'virin le'gzar dinei shel shivim shana. That someone says that amin yehish meirabe with all his strength, so they take away a gzar din of 70 years. In other words, even if something was decreed on him 70 years ago, nevertheless, by saying amin yehish meirabe with all his strength, he could take away such a decree. So the Rebbe said that the idea of 70 years is also a remez to the idea that we find that the first Golus, after Golus Mitzrayim, which was the Golus before Matan Torah, so after Matan Torah there were 4 Golus. So the first Golus is the Golus Bavel. After the Churban Bayis Rishon, after the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the Jews went to Bavel for 70 years. So the idea of Kol ha'emer amin yehish meirabe b'chol keichei, although amin is a very small word, and he's using all his strength in this amin yehish meirabe, so through that he is taking away the decree of Golus Bavel, which is in fact the shadish of all the other Goliaths, which means that a Jew utilizing his strength, all his strength, b'chol keichei, so that takes away the idea of Golus, takes away the idea of 70 years, which is Golus. And not only it takes it away, but rather it just like the Rambam says, that La'asid Lavi, when Mashiach will come, that not only the tiniest will no longer be, in other words, there will no longer be those fast days of Tisha B'Av and Shivas B'Tamas, those other days which are connected which are connected with, which are days of mourning, days are connected with the Churban Beis Hamikdash, but rather they will be days of joys. So the same idea, when you take away the Gzar Din of Shivim Shana, what you're accomplishing is not only taking away the Gzar Din, but rather that this Gzar Din will become a day, the Gzar Din itself will become Eir. And as the Rebbe brought down the Pasuk in Tehillim that says, Yoshes Cheshech Sisrei, the Pasuk in Tehillim, Kapitel Yudches, that Chassidus explains that it means that there is different types of darkness. There is a darkness which is connected to this world, which means that there is no light. In other words, it's missing light, and therefore it's dark. And then there's a darkness which is connected with the Eibishter himself. Sisrei, the Eibishter's Seiser. In other words, since the Eibishter is so high, so as far anything else, that anyone that tries to understand something, so when he looks at it as being dark. But not because it's really dark, but because it's so much light that as far as everyone else is concerned, it's considered darkness. So we transform the darkness of Golus and the darkness of the 70 years into not there, instead of it being Cheshech, it becomes Eir. And not only it becomes Eir, but it becomes this Cheshech, this darkness of Yoshes Cheshech Sisrei, which is the highest level in darkness. the darkness which is connected with the Eibishter himself. And that's all accomplished through Bechol Keiche, that when a person utilizes all his strength, and all his strength, as the Rabbi mentioned, could sometimes be a nekuda, 1 point. But when you have 1 point, it says a point has no space. It doesn't take up any space. But not because it's lower than space. In other words, it's too small to have any space. But rather it's something which includes all the space in this nekuda. In other words, we're dealing with a nekuda that's something that's all inclusive. And that brought out again the same idea of this entire Sicha, that when we're talking about Bechol Keiche, and the idea of Chof Ches Sivan, the idea of Keach, is not only you're using strength. We're dealing here Bechol Keiche, his strength. Which means, just like the Rebbe spoke about the Meraglim, that at that point in time, there was a new concept of an Avedis Hashem, of L'daitcho Aniyeni Mitzavelecho. In the same idea, as the Rebbe mentioned, that Vidar Keyech Potz, there is his derech. In other words, Asei Ritzei Neikir Ritzeincha. In other words, not only obeying what the Eibishter says, but rather utilizing your own keiches for the Eibishter, which is a higher level in Aveda. In the same way, this idea of Chof Ches Sivan is also Bechol Keiche, you're utilizing your Keach. And through utilizing your Keach, you are Mevatel, the Cheshech HaGolus, the darkness of Golus. And not only you take away the darkness of Golus, but rather you're utilizing the darkness of Golus. That you reveal that in the darkness of Golus, really the Eibishter is there. And as the Rebbe mentioned, that is also connected. Chof Ches Sivan, it comes within 3 days of Rish Chodesh Tammuz. There's Chof Ches, Chof Tes, and Lamed. Lamed is already Rish Chodesh. And we know that things that come within 3 days are connected one to the other. So the idea of Rish Chodesh Tammuz is referred to as Chodesh HaGeula, the Chodesh of redemption, the day, the month in which the Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz, the redemption of the Frierdiker Rebbe occurred. And besides that, in the month of Tammuz, we also see this idea of transforming the darkness as it is in Klippe and transforming it into Kedusha. Because the Gemara says that Tammuz, all the names of the months came with Eden from Bavel. In other words, in Bavel, the names, that's when the Jews gave these names. And then they brought it back to Eretz Yisrael from Bavel. Shemes HaChadoshim, Olu Imoim Mi Bavel. The names of the months went up with the Jews from Bavel. The Gemara says that Tammuz is a name of Avodah Zarah. And now this month, is this name, this word, for whatever reason, they took a word of Avodah Zarah, was now called a month of the year, and that's certainly something which becomes part of Kedusha. So we see that the concept of Tammuz is transforming Klippe into Kedusha, which is the same idea of the Keach, that when someone says Amen Yesh Merabah B'chol Keiche, he utilizes his own strength in this Amen Yesh Merabah. So what he accomplishes is that he's Kaden L'Gzardina Shel Shivim Shana. He transforms. Not only he takes away the Gzardin of Shivim Shana, but rather he transforms this Gzardin. That it should become from Cheshech HaGolus, it should become the Yoshech Cheshech Sisrei. In other words, the level of Cheshech, the level of darkness, which is connected to Atzmas and Hussein Sof, through the Gula Hamitis Vashleim. The Rebbe continued, he spoke about the end of the Parsha is the Parsha of Tzitzis. And by Tzitzis we also find something along this line, that on one hand Tzitzis is a mitzvah which is a very important mitzvah, and it's a mitzvah which is shkula keneged kol ha-mitzvahs. And the pasuk in fact tells us that through the mitzvah of Tzitzis it'll be uschartem es kol mitzvahs Hashem. We will remember all the mitzvahs of the Eibishter. And as Rashi explains that the word Tzitzis itself has the numerical value of 600, and plus the 8 strings and the 5 knots is 13. So therefore we have 613 mitzvahs. That's on one hand. On the other hand, we find that the mitzvah of tzitzis is a type of mitzvah which a person could really go through life, or a long period in time, and not be mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzis. Because there's no chiyuv, al pitera, to go look for a beged that has 4 corners and put on tzitzis. If a person is now wearing a beged that has 4 corners, he's not obligated to wear tzitzis. The Gemara tells us that if a person is now wearing tzitzis, and it's a time that for some reason or another, be'idno derischa, it's a time that the Eibishter is angry, so to speak, kaviyochel, so then he may be punished for now wearing tzitzis. But normally, al pi teira, al pi din, a person is not obligated to wear a garment that has 4 corners. It's just that if he has a garment that has 4 corners, he has to put on tzitzis. So it seems it's something which needs an explanation. If tzitzis is something that's so important, and through the mitzvah of tzitzis, one remembers all the mitzvahs, so why isn't it that the Eibishter didn't command us to wear a beged of 4 corners and have tzitzis on it? Why did the Eibishter put the mitzvah in such a way where a person has a choice whether or not to wear tzitzis? So the answer is because we're dealing here with a type of level of service of Hashem which is l'daitcha. In other words, if there would be a mitzvah, there would be a chiyuv for you to put on tzitzis, so then you would be missing in the mitzvah of tzitzis. Then you would merely be obeying the commandment. Now that you don't have a mitzvah, and so to speak, you have a choice whether or not to do it or not, that in itself brings out the mile of mitzvah tzitzis, that a person nevertheless goes ahead and gets a beged of dalet kafas and puts on tzitzis. So that thereby he's being mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzis. Not only he has the mitzvah and uschartem is called mitzvahs Hashem, everything that is connected with tzitzis, but more than that he has the mitzvah in a way of l'daitcha, that so to speak he's doing the mitzvah on his own initiative. The Rebbe also connected it with Pirkei Avos, that the Pirkei Avos of this week is Perek Shlishi, the 3rd Perek, which is connected to Chodesh Sivan, which the Rebbe also mentioned in the first Sicha, that this is Chof Ches Sivan. Sivan is the 3rd month, the month connected with Matan Torah. So obviously the strength that we have from the day Chof Ches is supposed to be connected to Torah. And also the idea, again, connected to the 3rd Perek, and we find that tzitzis has to be 4 corners. On the other hand, if it has 3 corners, it's not mechuyev in tzitzis. The Gemara says that what is the words gimel dalet? The letter is gimel dalet. Gimel means gemel, to give, and dalet means to a poor person. Gemel dalim, which means the gimel represents the giver, and the dalet represents the poor man, the receiver, which also is connected to gimel is the gimel ovis, and dalet is the dalet imois. So the Rebbe explained, again in the light of what he mentioned before, that the concept of tzitzis is connected to this idea of l'daitcha, of a person being mekayim mitzvahs with his own initiative, which is brought out in the dalet. The gemel is the Eibishter that tells us to do it. The dalet is the person that's receiving it, which is also, incidentally, the difference between the Yavis and the Imois, as the Rabbi mentioned. So the mitzvah of tzitzis brings out how the dal, which is the person, the receiver, does things on his own initiative in his service in the Eibishter. And the Rebbe concluded that everything has to be brought down in Peil Mamish and Maisa HaMaisa Wa'ikar, which in fact, that was the whole chet of the Meraglim, that the Meraglim didn't want to go into Eretz Yisrael. And the reason was, as it's brought down in Chassidus, and there's really 2 ways that it's brought down. Either that they wanted everything should remain in Elam HaMachshava, because in the Midbar, they weren't actually, so to speak, in this world. In other words, they were living on a different plane. They were getting the man, and they were having the water from Be'er Shel Miriam. Everything was on a different plane. or as other sometimes brought down, that they wanted to remain in Elam HaDibur, and they didn't want to come down to Elam HaMaisa, to the world of action, which is the idea of Eretz Nisheves, of Eretz Yisrael. So the Rebbe concluded that everything should be brought down in Elam HaMaisa, HaMaisa Hu HaYikar, in Hisafin, Limudat Torah, and Kiyum HaMitzvahs, in the light of Chof Ches Sivan, which is the Keach of the month of Sivan, which is the month connected to Matan Torah. And the Rebbe also concluded by again being Me'eder, to utilize the months of the summer where people have more free time. So there's never such a thing as free time from the Eibishter Chas v'Sholem. It's only that a person is free from his obligations towards worldly things, and he should utilize that time that he's free from those obligations that he normally has during the year in the service of Hashem, and Limudat Torah, and in Kiyum HaMitzvahs. And through all this, we will be zeicha speedily to the binyan Beis Hamikdash b'mheira v'yameinu. A gute Woche.